What if the most dangerous thing that ever happened to you wasn't a tragedy, a loss, or a failure, but a moment when you felt nothing at all? What if the real warning hidden in one of the Bible's smallest books is actually about the slow, quiet death of a human soul? There is a question that most people never think to ask when they read the Bible. Not the big theological questions, not the ones about creation or the end of the world, but a smaller, more personal one, the kind that keeps you awake at night if you let yourself really sit with it. The question is this: how does a good person become someone who no longer cares, not overnight, not in one dramatic moment of rebellion, but slowly, quietly, one small decision at a time, one dismissed feeling at a time, one unopened door at a time? That is exactly what the Book of Obadiah is about. And if you've never heard of Obadiah, that's actually the point. It is the shortest book in the entire Old Testament, 21 verses. Most people skip right past it. Most Bible study groups never touch it. Most Sunday sermons never open it. And yet, tucked inside those 21 verses is one of the most devastating psychological and spiritual portraits ever written. A warning so urgent, so precise, and so terrifyingly relevant that it reads less like ancient prophecy and more like a mirror held directly in front of your face. But to understand Obadiah, you first have to understand a man named Daniel Hargrove. Daniel was 61 years old when his younger brother called him for the first time in 11 years. He was sitting at his kitchen table in Knoxville, Tennessee, drinking his second cup of coffee and reading the morning paper, a habit he had kept for 30 years. The phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen. He saw the name, and for a long moment he didn't move. His wife, Carol, walked in from the hallway. She noticed the expression on his face. "Who is it?" she asked. "It's Robert," he said. Carol set down the dish towel she was carrying. She knew the history. She knew everything. The argument at their mother's funeral, the lawsuit over the property, the years of silence. She walked over slowly, put her hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Are you going to answer it?" Daniel watched the phone ring 4 times, 5 times, 6. Then it went to voicemail. He set the phone face down on the table, picked up his coffee, and said without looking up, "He'll call back if it's important." He said it so calmly, so evenly, as if 11 years of silence between brothers was just a minor inconvenience, as if the phone ringing was simply background noise like a television left on in another room. Carol watched him. She didn't say anything, but she noticed something that she couldn't quite name, a stillness in him that wasn't peace, a quiet that wasn't rest. It was the quiet of something closed. Now here is where the Book of Obadiah enters the room. Obadiah was written about a nation called Edom, and Edom was not a foreign enemy of Israel. Edom was family. Edom descended from Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, the man who became Israel. That means the Edomites and the Israelites were brothers, literally brothers, connected by blood, by ancestry, by centuries of shared history. And when Jerusalem fell, when Israel's enemies invaded and burned the city and dragged the people away in chains, the Edomites did something that Obadiah recorded for all eternity. They watched. They stood on the other side of the valley, and they watched their brothers suffer. And not only did they watch, they celebrated. They cheered. They blocked the escape routes so the fleeing Israelites couldn't get away. They handed survivors over to the enemy. They entered the city and took what was left. They helped destroy the people they were supposed to love. And Obadiah looked at all of it and said, "This didn't happen in a single day. This didn't come from nowhere. There were stages. There was a process, a descent, a slow, invisible hardening one decision at a time until the heart that was once capable of compassion became a heart of stone. 4 stages. And that is exactly what this video is going to walk through. Because here is what makes Obadiah not just ancient history. Here is what makes it terrifying. The 4 stages he describes don't apply only to nations. They apply to individuals. They apply to families. They apply to anyone who has ever watched someone they loved suffer and felt something inside them go quiet. They apply to Daniel Hargrove, sitting at that kitchen table, turning his phone face down. They may apply to you. Robert's voicemail lasted 47 seconds. Daniel played it 3 hours later, standing alone in his garage. He listened to his younger brother's voice, rougher now, older, nothing like the kid who used to follow him around their father's farm, and he heard the words Robert said. He heard the catch in his throat. He heard the word hospital. He heard the word serious. And Daniel stood there for a long time after the message ended. I thought about the lawsuit. He thought about the things Robert had said at their mother's graveside, words that had landed like punches, words he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times since. He thought about the years he had spent rebuilding his life after the family fell apart. And then he thought something that frightened him later when he remembered it, not because it was cruel, but because it was so ordinary. He thought, I just don't feel anything. Not anger, not grief, not relief, nothing. He put the phone back in his pocket and went inside for dinner. Chug. The Book of Obadiah opens with a declaration that sounds like thunder. The vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord, God concerning Edom. No introduction, no genealogy. No soft beginning. Obadiah doesn't ease you into it. He starts with the verdict already rendered, the judgment already decided, and this is the genius of the text. He works backward. He shows you how Edom got there. He pulls back the curtain on the process that led a brother to betray a brother. Stage 1. Obadiah says, begins with pride. Not the loud, obvious kind. Not the pride that announces itself in arrogance and contempt. The subtle kind. The kind that feels like confidence. The kind that feels like self-sufficiency. The kind that says quietly inside the privacy of your own heart, I don't need anyone. I am fine on my own. What happens to them is not my concern. Edom lived in the mountains, high, fortified, secure. And that security became a spiritual condition, because when you never feel vulnerable, you begin to lose the ability to recognize vulnerability in others. When nothing can touch you, you stop being moved by what touches everyone else. Obadiah records what God said to Edom directly. The pride of your heart has deceived you, not corrupted you, not destroyed you, deceived you, because that is the first stage. You don't know it's happening. The heart begins to harden, and it feels like strength. Carol found Daniel in the living room that evening, staring at nothing. "Did you listen to the message?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, and he looked at her. And she saw it again, that quality in his eyes she couldn't name. That distance that lived just behind his expression. He made his choices, Daniel said. I made mine. Carol sat down across from him. She had been married to this man for 34 years. She knew every version of him. And the version sitting in that chair right now frightened her more than any argument, any anger, any grief had ever frightened her. Because she had seen Daniel furious. She had seen him heartbroken. She had seen him lost. But she had never seen him this calm about something that should have shattered him. Daniel, she said carefully, your brother is in the hospital. I know, he said. Are you going to call him back? He looked at the television turned off, just a dark screen, and he said, I'll think about it. Carol sat there for a moment. Then she said something quietly that she had been carrying for a long time. I'm not worried about Robert right now, she said. I'm worried about you. Daniel turned to look at her. What does that mean? He asked. It means, she said slowly, that I've watched you build a wall around yourself for 11 years, and I don't think you know anymore what's on the other side of it. That is stage 1 of a hardened heart. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like sin. It feels like protection. It feels like wisdom. It feels like you have simply learned the hard way not to be fooled again, not to be hurt again, not to leave yourself open again. But what is actually happening, Obadiah says, is that the heart is beginning to close. And once it starts, once pride takes root, and deception grows in the soil of self-protection, the next stage comes almost naturally. Because a closed heart doesn't stay still. It moves. It moves in a direction. And the direction it moves, the second stage Obadiah reveals, is something so common, so recognizable, so woven into ordinary human experience that you may have seen it in your own life without ever having a name for it. But that stage and the 3 that follow are going to unfold in the rest of this story. Because what Obadiah is really telling us is not just about Edom, and it is not just about Daniel Hargrove in his living room refusing to return a phone call. It is about every human heart that has ever gone from warmth to silence without knowing exactly when the change happened. And the warning God gave through Obadiah is still alive today, just as urgent, just as clear, just as personal. Because the God who judged Edom is the same God who looks at every heart, including yours and mine, and sees not just what we have done, but what we have stopped feeling. And that is the most dangerous place of all. Carol's words stayed in the room long after she said them. Daniel didn't answer her right away. He just looked at her with that same unreadable expression, the one she had been trying to decode for years, and then he stood up, said he was tired, and went to bed. He left her sitting alone in the living room, with the question still hanging in the air between them like smoke. And that night, Carol did something she hadn't done in a long time. She sat in the dark and she prayed. Not a polished prayer, not the kind with the right words in the right order. She just talked to God the way a woman talks when she is afraid of something she can't quite name yet. She said, I don't know what's happening to him, but I know something is wrong, and I don't know how to reach him anymore. She didn't hear an audible answer, but when she finally went to bed, she had a feeling quiet and certain that what was wrong with Daniel had been wrong for a very long time, and that it was going to take more than a phone call to fix it. That feeling, it turned out, was exactly right. Because what Carol was witnessing in her husband was stage 2 of what Obadiah describes in the nation of Edom. And stage 2 doesn't look like a crisis. It doesn't look like a breakdown. It looks from the outside almost exactly like normal life. Stage 2 is called contempt, not hatred. Contempt is different from hatred. Hatred is hot. Contempt is cold. Hatred still cares enough to be angry. Contempt has moved past caring. It has looked at another person or another nation and quietly decided your pain is your own fault. You made your choices. I made mine. Whatever is happening to you, you probably deserve it. Obadiah records the moment Edom crossed that line. It was the day Jerusalem began to fall. Babylon came against Israel with overwhelming force. The city burned, the people fled, and the Edomites who lived just across the valley, who shared blood and history and ancestors with the people suffering on the other side, did not mourn. They did not grieve. They did not send help or open their borders or offer shelter. They stood on the high ground and they watched. And according to Obadiah, while they watched, they felt something. Not sorrow, not guilt. Something that felt in the moment almost like satisfaction. The sense that the people who had always seemed more blessed, more chosen, more favored, were finally getting what was coming to them. And God recorded that moment. God saw it. And he said to Edom through Obadiah, "You should not have gloated over your brother in the day of his misfortune. You should not have." Present tense, as if God was watching it happen in real time, as if he was standing right there, witnessing the exact moment a heart moved from indifference into something darker. That is the terrifying precision of Obadiah. He doesn't just describe what Edom did. He describes the internal movement, the micro shift in the soul that preceded every action. And that movement is contempt. Daniel Hargrove had not arrived at contempt overnight. It had taken 11 years to get there. 11 years of replaying what Robert said at their mother's funeral. 11 years of the lawsuit and the silence and the pride of a man who had decided quietly, firmly, without dramatic announcement, that he was done being hurt by someone who should have protected him instead. The morning after Carol's prayer, Daniel came downstairs early. Carol was already at the table with her coffee and her Bible. He poured himself a cup without saying much, sat down across from her, and for a moment they were just two people in a quiet kitchen. Then Carol said, "I think you should call him back." Daniel looked at his coffee. "Carol, I know," she said. "I know everything you're going to say, but I need to say this first." She paused. "When's the last time you prayed for Robert?" The question landed in the room like something physical. Daniel set his mug down, and the look that crossed his face was not anger. It was something more complicated than anger. It was the look of a man who had just been asked to examine a room he'd been keeping locked for years. "I pray for him," he said. Carol looked at him steadily. When he opened his mouth, then closed it. And in that silence, in the 2 or 3 seconds where he tried to remember the last time, he had genuinely, sincerely prayed for his brother, with a heart that wanted good things for him. Daniel Hargrove found something he wasn't expecting. He found nothing. Not a specific memory, not a date, not even a vague recollection. Just a blank space where compassion had once lived, and that terrified him more than he let Carol see. He stood up, said he had errands to run, left the house, and Carol sat alone at the table again, and this time she didn't pray. She just opened her Bible. And almost without planning it, her eyes landed on a page in the Minor Prophets, a short book, 21 verses, a name she almost skipped past, Obadiah. She started reading, and the further she read, the slower she went, because what she was reading wasn't history. It was a portrait, a step-by-step description of something she had been watching happen inside her husband for over a decade. She read verse 12 slowly, out loud, quietly to herself. You should not have gloated over your brother in the day of his misfortune. You should not have rejoiced over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. She stopped, read it again, and she thought about Daniel standing in the garage listening to Robert's voicemail. She thought about his face when he came back inside. She thought about what he hadn't said, the absence where emotion should have been, and she realized with a chill that the danger wasn't that Daniel hated Robert. The danger was that he had arrived at a place so much worse than hate. He had arrived at the place where Robert's suffering simply didn't register anymore. That was the second stage, and Carol now had a name for what she had seen in her husband's eyes. She kept reading. Stage 3 came next in Obadiah's account, and when it came fast, because that is the nature of a hardened heart once it passes through contempt. The next movement is almost instinctive, almost automatic, as if the soul, having closed off compassion, now needs to justify its own coldness, needs to find a reason, a story, a narrative that makes the indifference feel not just acceptable, but righteous. Obadiah calls this Stage 3 participation in evil, not because Edom sat down and made a formal decision to be wicked, but because one morning when the opportunity presented itself, when the enemy was moving through the valley and the fleeing Israelites were trying to escape, the Edomites made a series of small, practical choices. They stood at the crossroads and turned survivors back. They handed people over to those who wanted to destroy them. They entered Jerusalem after the battle and took what remained. Each choice in the moment probably felt justified, probably felt like just a natural consequence of the situation, probably felt less like evil and more like simply not going out of your way to help people who honestly brought this on themselves. That is the most frightening thing Obadiah reveals about Stage 3. It doesn't feel like a dramatic crossing of a line. It feels like the natural next step after you've already convinced yourself that the suffering on the other side isn't your problem. Daniel was in his truck when his phone rang again. Not Robert this time. It was his daughter, Melissa. 28 years old, living in Atlanta, close to both her father and her uncle, in ways that had always put her in an uncomfortable position between them. He answered. "Dad," she said, and her voice had that quality it got when she was trying to stay calm and wasn't fully succeeding. "Have you talked to Uncle Robert?" "He left a message," Daniel said. "Dad, he has a heart condition. They're saying it's serious, like actually serious." A pause. "He asked about you." Daniel gripped the steering wheel. "He asked about me," he repeated flat. "I wanted to know if you knew. He wanted to know if you were going to call." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, I don't want to pressure you. I know the history. I know everything that happened. But he's your brother. And I needed to tell you because nobody else was going to." Daniel said, "Thank you for calling, sweetheart." "Are you going to call him?" "I'll think about it." And there it was again. That phrase. I'll think about it. The phrase that had become Daniel's way of closing a door without admitting he was closing it. Melissa stayed on the line for a moment, and then she said something quietly that cut through all of it. "Daddy, I love you, but I've been watching you carry this for 11 years, and it's not protecting you anymore. It's just making you smaller." He didn't respond. "Think about it," she said softly, and hung up. Daniel sat in his parked truck for a long time after the call ended. The engine was running, but he wasn't going anywhere. He sat there and he thought about his daughter's voice. He thought about the word she had used, smaller. And somewhere deep under the wall he had built, somewhere in a place he hadn't visited in a long time, something shifted. Not much, not enough, not yet, but something. Because the thing about a hardened heart is that it is never entirely without cracks, and sometimes it only takes the right voice, the right word, the right moment of stillness to find one. The question was whether Daniel would walk through it, or whether he would start the truck, pull out of the parking lot, and choose. For the 100th time, the easier, quieter, more comfortable road of a man who had convinced himself that letting go of a brother was the same thing as letting go of pain. Obadiah had watched Edom make that choice, and he had written down what God said about it, not with cruelty, not with rage, with grief. Because the God of Obadiah was not primarily a God looking for reasons to punish. He was a God who had watched a brother turn away from a brother and felt the specific, irreplaceable grief of someone who understands exactly what is being lost. And he said it plainly, "The day is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head." Not as revenge, as consequence, because that is the law written into the structure of the human soul. The heart that refuses to feel eventually loses the ability to feel. And the man who builds a wall to keep pain out discovers far too late that the wall also keeps everything else out. The warmth, the connection, the love that was always supposed to be the point. Daniel Hargrove was not a bad man. That was the whole tragedy of it. He was a man who had been genuinely hurt, who had made what felt like reasonable choices, who had protected himself in ways that made sense, and who had arrived without ever making one clearly evil decision, at a place where his brother was lying in a hospital bed, and Daniel could listen to a voicemail about it and feel nothing. Stage 2 had done its work quietly, thoroughly, almost invisibly, and Stage 3 was already knocking at the door. Daniel started the truck. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove. No destination, just movement. The kind of driving a man does when sitting still feels more dangerous than going somewhere. Anywhere. Just to have something to do with his hands and his eyes, so his mind doesn't have to sit alone with itself. Melissa's word followed him the whole way. Smaller. He turned the radio on. Country station. Turned it off again. Tried a news channel. Turned that off too. Because no matter what filled the air in that truck underneath it all was his daughter's voice saying the one word that had found a crack in 11 years of careful construction. Smaller. He drove for 40 minutes before he realized he had looped back toward home. And that was when his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Not a call this time. A text. From a number he didn't recognize at first. Then he read the area code, and he knew. It was from someone at the hospital. A nurse named Linda. She had apparently gotten his number from Melissa. The text said 3 sentences. It said Robert had been asking for him. It said the doctors were moving Robert to the cardiac ICU. And it said simply at the end, no pressure, no judgment. Just 3 words placed there like a quiet hand on a shoulder. He loves you. Daniel read the text once, then again. Then he set the phone face down on the seat, and he drove past his own house without stopping. Now here is where the Book of Obadiah moves into its 3rd and most devastating stage. Because what happened next in the ancient record and in Daniel Hargrove's truck on a Tuesday afternoon follows a pattern that Obadiah saw clearly 3,000 years ago. A pattern so precise it reads like a diagnosis. Stage 3 is not just contempt anymore. Stage 3 is the moment the hardened heart begins to take action based on its coldness. Not passive indifference. Active choice. Edom didn't just watch Jerusalem burn. They moved. They positioned themselves at the crossroads where fleeing survivors were trying to escape. Obadiah says it with devastating specificity in verse 14. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. You should not have handed over his survivors in the day of distress. Stood at the crossroads. That phrase, think about what it means. It means Edom made a deliberate decision to place themselves exactly where their brothers would run for safety and turn them back into the arms of the enemy. They didn't just fail to help, they actively prevented help from reaching people who needed it. And the reason they could do that, the reason it was psychologically possible for them to stand at that crossroads and make that choice, was because Stage 1 and Stage 2 had done their work so thoroughly. Pride had created distance. Contempt had deadened the feeling of shared humanity. And now Stage 3 arrived as the almost logical conclusion. If these people don't matter to me, and if their suffering is their own fault, then the choices I make about them are not really moral choices at all. They are just practical decisions. That is the most terrifying sentence in this entire teaching. Read it again. If these people don't matter to me, the choices I make about them are not really moral choices at all. They are just practical decisions. That is how Edom justified standing at the crossroads. That is how ordinary people in ordinary moments become participants in extraordinary cruelty. Not because they planned to be monstrous, but because the slow process of hardening had quietly reclassified the people they were supposed to love from people who matter into people whose problems are not my concern. Daniel Hargrove hadn't stood at any crossroads. He wasn't handing anyone over to an enemy. But that evening, when he finally came home, he did something that belonged to the same category of choice, smaller in scale, but identical in structure. Carol was at the kitchen table when he walked in. She looked up. She saw something different in his face this time. Not the closed calm from before, but something more complicated. Something that looked like a man fighting himself. "Did you see the text from the hospital?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Daniel." "Carol, I need you to stop." His voice came out harder than he intended. She went quiet, and he sat down heavily across from her and pressed both hands flat on the table like he was trying to hold something down. "I know what you want me to do," he said. "I know what Melissa wants. I know what that nurse wants. But nobody in this situation knows what Robert put me through. Nobody knows what it felt like to stand at Mom's grave and have your own brother say what he said to me, in front of everyone." His voice cracked slightly on that last word. He recovered fast. I built something back from that. I built a life that doesn't have that kind of pain in it. And I'm supposed to just walk back in there and open myself up again, because he's sick." Carol didn't answer immediately. She let the words settle, and then she said very quietly, "I hear you." Daniel looked at her, surprised almost. "I hear all of it," she said. "And I'm not saying what he did was okay. I'm saying something different." She paused. "I'm saying that the person sitting across from me right now is not the man I married. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a fact. The man I married felt things, even hard things, even painful things. He cried at his father's funeral. He held his daughters when they were born and shook like a leaf. He felt things, Daniel." She stopped. "Let that land." "When did you stop?" she asked. The question broke something open in the room. Daniel's jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere far away, and for a moment, just a moment, Carol thought she saw it. The crack. The place underneath all the stone where the original wound still lived, still raw, still exactly the shape it had been the day it was made. And then he stood up, said he needed some air, walked out the back door. Carol sat alone again. She picked up her Bible from where she'd left it that morning, still open to Obadiah. And she read the verse she had stopped at, verse 15. "The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head." She had always read that verse as a warning about punishment, but sitting there now thinking about her husband, she understood it differently. It wasn't just punishment. It was consequence, built into the structure of how the soul works. A heart that refuses to feel toward others gradually loses the ability to feel toward itself. A person who seals off compassion doesn't just lose compassion for others, they lose access to their own inner life. The wall keeps everything out, and eventually the person on the inside of that wall is just as trapped as anyone on the outside. That was the consequence Obadiah was describing. Not God destroying Edom from the outside, but Edom having destroyed itself from the inside long before any judgment came. Outside, Daniel stood in the dark. I was looking at nothing in particular, just the sky, just the quiet. And for the first time in a long time, maybe in years, he let himself think about Robert, not as the man who had hurt him, but as the boy he had grown up with. The kid who used to chase fireflies in their backyard in July. The teenager who had cried at their father's hospital bedside and grabbed Daniel's hand without saying anything. The young man who had stood beside him on the worst days and the best ones. That person was lying in a cardiac ICU right now asking for him. And Daniel felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long, it almost scared him. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't clean. It was more like the feeling when a limb that has been asleep starts waking up painful, before it becomes feeling burning, before it becomes warmth. He pulled out his phone. He looked at the number for a long time, and then something happened that changed everything. He didn't call Robert. He called the hospital and asked for the cardiac ICU nurses station. And when a woman answered, he gave his name and said he was Robert Hargrove's brother. And there was a brief pause on the line. And the woman said, "Mr. Hargrove, your brother has been asking about you all day." Daniel's voice came out rougher than he expected. "How is he?" "He's stable right now," she said. "But sir, he keeps asking if his brother knows. He keeps asking if you're coming." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. "Tell him I know," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him I know." He hung up, stood there. And the thing that Obadiah understood, the thing that God had been trying to show through the story of Edom all along, began in that dark backyard in Knoxville, Tennessee, to become visible. Because here is the biblical truth at the heart of Stage 3, the truth that makes this stage so critical and so urgent. Stage 3 is the last place where the heart can still turn around. Edom passed through Stage 3 without stopping. They made the active choice to stand at the crossroads and turn their brothers away. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold that Obadiah says led directly to the fourth and final stage, the stage from which there is no record of return. But Daniel had stood at his own crossroads. He had looked at the choice in front of him, and he had not turned away completely. He had made one phone call, left one message. 3 words passed through a nurse to a hospital room. "I know, I'm coming." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the end of anything difficult. The wall was still mostly standing. The wound was still open. 11 years of silence didn't dissolve in a phone call. But the direction had changed. And in the economy of the human soul, and in the economy of the God who wrote this warning through Obadiah, direction matters more than distance. Because the God of Obadiah is not a God who demands that you arrive already healed. He is a God who watches which way you are facing. He is a God who sees the first movement of a heart that has been still for too long. He is a God who, when a prodigal son was still a great way off, ran toward him. Carol heard the back door open. She looked up. Daniel stood in the doorway. His eyes were red. Not crying, not yet, but the kind of red that comes just before the kind that means something is breaking loose that had been held for a very long time. "I called the hospital," he said. Carol set down her Bible. "I told them to tell him I'm coming," Daniel said. She stood up slowly, walked to him, and she put her hands on his face, this man she had loved for 34 years, this man she had watched slowly disappear behind a wall. And she looked at him the way you look at someone who has just come back from somewhere far away. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. But inside, she was thinking about Obadiah's warning, and she was thinking about something else, something she had noticed in those 21 verses that most people miss entirely. The warning was not the last word. Tucked at the very end of this small, overlooked book, after all the judgment, after all the consequence, after everything Edom had done, and everything it had lost, was a promise. A small, extraordinary promise about restoration, about return, about the kind of ending that only God can write. She hadn't told Daniel about it yet, but she knew it was coming. They drove to the hospital the next morning, not that night. Daniel had made the call. Carol had held his face in her hands, and then something in him had gone very quiet. Not the closed quiet from before, a different kind. The kind of quiet that comes after something cracks open, and the person isn't sure yet what to do with the air rushing in. He had sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight. Carol stayed with him. They didn't talk much. She made tea he didn't drink. He stared at his hands. Once around 10 o'clock, he said, "I don't know how to walk in that room." And she said, "You don't have to know how, you just have to walk in." He nodded slowly, said nothing else. They left the house at 7:30 the next morning. The drive took 40 minutes. Daniel held the steering wheel with both hands the entire way. Carol watched the road and prayed silently, the kind of prayer that doesn't have many words, just a direction, just a leaning toward God. Just the wordless request of a woman who understood that what was about to happen in a hospital room could go many different ways, and that only one of those ways led somewhere good. She thought about Obadiah the whole drive. Specifically, she thought about stage 4. The stage she hadn't told Daniel about yet. The stage that in the ancient text represented the point where Edom's story stopped being a warning and became a verdict. She had been sitting with it since the night before, turning it over, trying to understand what it meant for her husband, for Robert, for the two of them walking into that building. Because stage 4 is the one that most people don't see coming. Stages 1 through 3 have a logic to them that is almost understandable. Pride, you can understand that. Contempt, painful, but recognizable. Active participation in coldness, terrible but traceable, back to the wound that started it. But stage 4 is different. Stage 4 is the stage where the heart doesn't just go cold, it goes convinced. Obadiah records it in the way he describes Edom's final posture. By the time judgment arrived, Edom was not ashamed. Edom was not conflicted. Edom had arrived at a place of such complete self-justification that what they had done to their brothers felt not just acceptable, but righteous. They had constructed a version of events in which they were the reasonable ones, the strong ones, the ones who had simply made sensible choices in a difficult world. The suffering of Israel wasn't their fault. The decisions they had made were just that, decisions, practical, logical, not moral failures at all. That is stage 4. When the hardened heart stops just feeling nothing and starts believing it is right to feel nothing, and that God said through Obadiah was the point of no return. Not because God stopped being capable of mercy, but because a heart that has fully convinced itself it has nothing to repent of will never turn toward the only thing that can heal it. Daniel pulled into the hospital parking lot and sat for a moment after he cut the engine. "I need a minute," he said. "Take it," Carol said. He sat there, and then he said something that Carol hadn't expected. He said, "What if he's angrier than I am?" She turned to look at him. "What if I walk in there, and he looks at me the way I've been looking at him for 11 years? Daniel's voice was rough. "What if he's been building the same wall? What if he doesn't want me there?" Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "The nurse said he's been asking for you all day. People say a lot of things when they're scared." "Daniel." She waited until he looked at her. "He said your name. He wanted to know if you were coming. That's not a man who built a wall. That's a man who's been standing on the other side of yours waiting." Something moved across Daniel's face. Guilt, maybe. Or the specific grief that comes from realizing you have wasted time that cannot be recovered. He looked away, pressed his hand flat against the dashboard. "I've been the Edomite," he said quietly. Carol blinked. He had never used that word. She hadn't told him about Obadiah yet. She had left her Bible at home. "What did you say?" she asked. "Last night after you fell asleep," he said. "I couldn't sleep. I got up and I read something. I don't even know what made me open it. It was that little book, the short one, the one with the prophet Obadiah." He paused. "I read the whole thing. Took about 10 minutes. His jaw tightened. And then I sat there for 2 hours. Carol felt something move through her chest that was almost too large to contain. In 34 years of marriage, she had learned that God works in ways that are almost never what you expect. But occasionally, He does something so precisely timed, so utterly specific, that it stops you cold. Her husband, alone at midnight, opening the same 21 verses she had read the morning before, without knowing she had read them. Which part, she managed, stayed with you? "The crossroads," he said immediately, "where it says they stood at the crossroads and turned the survivors back." He shook his head slowly. "I've been standing at my own crossroads for 11 years. Every time Robert got close, every time there was a chance to end this, I turned him back. I didn't even know I was doing it. I thought I was protecting myself." He stopped. "I was just turning him back." He got out of the truck. Carol followed. And as they walked toward the entrance, she thought about the 4th stage, and she thought about what made Daniel's story different from Edom's. Because Edom had read the same internal signs and chosen to keep going. Edom had arrived at stage 4, the self-righteous certainty that their coldness was justified, and had stayed there, had built their identity around it, had made their indifference into a theology. Daniel had been standing at the border of stage 4. That midnight reading of Obadiah had caught him just before he crossed it, just before the hardness became not just habit, but conviction. Just before "I don't feel anything" became "I am right not to feel anything." And the difference between those two sentences is the difference between a heart that can still be reached and a heart that has closed its last door. They found Robert's room on the 3rd floor. A nurse, Linda, the one who had sent the text, met them in the hallway and said Robert had been awake since 5 in the morning and had asked about his brother twice already that day. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, the way nurses say things when they have seen enough of life to know which moments matter and which ones are just noise. Daniel stopped outside the door. Carol stood beside him. She didn't push. She didn't touch his arm or give him a look. She just waited, because she understood, had always understood, that there are moments in a person's life when the most loving thing you can do is simply be present without pressure. When the door has to be walked through by one person alone. He knocked once, soft, almost like he wasn't sure he was allowed. A voice from inside said, "Come in." Daniel opened the door. Robert was smaller than Daniel remembered, or maybe it was just the context. The hospital bed, the monitors, the thin gown instead of work clothes. He was 60 years old and he looked it, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes. But the eyes themselves, the eyes were the same eyes that had looked up at Daniel from the floor of their father's barn when they were boys after Daniel had dared him to climb the hayloft and he'd fallen. Same eyes, just older. Those eyes looked at Daniel now, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Robert said, "You came." Just those 2 words, not accusatory, not relieved, just stated, like a man who had been waiting long enough that the waiting itself had become its own kind of truth, and the arrival felt less like rescue and more like the completion of something that had always been supposed to happen. "Yeah, Daniel said. His voice was barely there. "I came." He walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. Carol stayed in the doorway. She looked at the two brothers, both of them gray, both of them worn, both of them carrying 11 years of silence in their bodies like a weight, and she felt the specific ache of someone watching something holy happen in very ordinary wrapping. Robert looked at his brother for a moment, then he said, "I've wanted to call you for years." Daniel looked at the floor. "I know. I didn't know what to say. After everything." "Neither did I." Robert's voice dropped lower. "What I said at Mom's funeral, I've gone over it 10,000 times, Daniel. I said it wrong. I said it because I was angry and I was grieving, and I handled it wrong." He stopped. "That's not an excuse. I need you to know I know." Daniel looked up then, and Carol from the doorway saw something in her husband's face she hadn't seen in 11 years. Not resolution, not forgiveness fully formed and delivered in a neat package. Something rawer than that, something earlier than that. The look of a man who has been carrying an enormous thing for a very long time and has just been offered for the first time the possibility of setting it down. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't entirely not yet. That was going to take time, take more conversations, take the kind of slow, unglamorous work that real reconciliation requires when real wounds have been made. But he said something that was true. He said, "I should have called you back." Robert closed his eyes briefly, opened them, and the exhale that came from him was the kind that starts somewhere deep and has been held there for a long time. That was the moment. Not the healing, the turning. Not the arrival, the decision to walk toward it. And Obadiah, 3,000 years ago, had described both the warning and the only escape from it with the same precision. The warning, a heart that hardens in stages, will harden completely if it does not stop. The escape, the moment you recognize which stage you are in, is the moment you still have a choice. But that moment has a door, and the door does not stay open forever. Edom passed through stage 4 without stopping. Edom convinced itself entirely that it had done nothing wrong, that the suffering of its brothers was not its concern, that strength meant never feeling the pain of someone else's loss. And God looked at that and said, "The day of reckoning comes for every nation, for every heart, for every man who stood at the crossroads and made his choice." But the same God who gave that warning is the God who ran toward a prodigal son, still covered in mud. The same God who told Jonah reluctantly, stubbornly, angrily, sitting under a dead plant, that he cared about a city full of people who didn't yet know their right hand from their left. The God of Obadiah is a God of warning, but warning is not condemnation. Warning is the voice that speaks before the door, closes specifically, urgently, personally, into the life of anyone who still has time to hear it. Daniel Hargrove heard it at midnight over 21 verses, and the next morning he walked through a door. That is not the end of the story. Not for Daniel, not for Robert. The wall didn't come down in one conversation. The years of silence didn't simply evaporate. There was more ahead, harder conversations, old pain surfacing at unexpected moments. The slow and non-linear work of two brothers trying to remember who they were to each other before the wound. But the direction had changed. And Carol, standing in that doorway, watching her husband sit beside his brother for the first time in 11 years, thought about the last verse she had read in Obadiah, the one that came after all the warning, the one that most people miss because they stop reading after the judgment. It was a promise. Small, specific, almost startling after everything that had come before it. And the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Not Edom's kingdom, not Israel's triumph, not the victory of any nation or any wounded pride. The Lord's. The God who had watched brothers betray brothers since Cain and Abel. The God who had seen every crossroads, every wall, every closed door. The God who had written a warning through a prophet with 21 verses and a name most people skip past. That God was not done. That God was never done. And sitting in a hospital room in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the space between two brothers who had almost run out of time, he was still at work. 3 weeks after that hospital room, Daniel Hargrove sat in his truck outside a coffee shop in Knoxville and waited for his brother. Not because Robert had been discharged and life had immediately become simple. Not because the 11 years had dissolved and left no residue, but because 3 weeks ago something had shifted in a direction that neither of them had yet fully mapped, and now they were doing the unglamorous, uncomfortable, necessary work of two men trying to find out if the road back to each other still existed. Robert had spent 9 days in the hospital. Daniel had visited 4 of them. Not every day there had been a day in the middle where the old weight had come back so heavily that Daniel had sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes and then driven home without going in. He had told Carol about it that night. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said, "I couldn't do it today." And she had looked at him and said, "But you went. You sat in that parking lot. That's not nothing." She was right. It wasn't nothing. It was the difference between a man running from something and a man who is moving towards something, even when the movement is slow and stuttered and imperfect. Robert had been discharged on a Thursday. Melissa had driven up from Atlanta to help. She had cried in the hospital hallway when Daniel arrived that first day. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a daughter cries when something she has been praying about for years finally begins to move in the right direction. She hadn't said much. She had just hugged her father for a long time and whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." And those 2 words had done something to Daniel that no argument, no pressure, no logical case for reconciliation had ever managed to do. They had cracked him open a little further. Now he sat in the truck, waiting. And when Robert pulled into the parking lot, slower than he used, to move more careful the way a man moves, after his heart has reminded him loudly that it is not invincible, Daniel got out and met him on the sidewalk. They stood there for a moment. 2 brothers, gray-haired, weathered, carrying between them decades of shared history that no amount of silence had actually erased. Robert said, "You look terrible." Daniel said, "You look worse." And for the first time in 11 years, both of them laughed. Just briefly. Just one short, surprised laugh that neither of them had been expecting, the kind that escapes before you can control it. The kind that comes from a place so old and so familiar that even 11 years couldn't bury it entirely. They went inside, ordered coffee, sat across from each other. And then the real conversation began. It was not easy. Let no one mistake what happened in that coffee shop for a Hallmark ending. Robert brought up the lawsuit. First said he knew his lawyer had been aggressive, and he should have stepped in sooner. Daniel said that what Robert had said at their mother's funeral had landed in a place that didn't heal clean. Robert said he knew that, said he had known it since the moment the words left his mouth, said he had replayed that scene so many times it had become a kind of torment. Daniel said he hadn't called back, said he had heard Robert's voice on a voicemail and had stood in his garage and made a choice, not a dramatic choice, not a declared one, just the quiet, ordinary choice to put the phone in his pocket and walk back inside. That was the moment, Daniel said. That was where it really started. Not the funeral, not the lawsuit. That voicemail. Robert looked at him. Which voicemail? The one a few weeks ago, when you first called from the hospital. Robert shook his head slowly. Daniel, I called you 6 months ago, left a message, said I wanted to talk. A pause. You never called back. Daniel went still. 6 months ago. There had been another voicemail. He remembered it now, vaguely, the way you remember something. You filed away under a category called Not Today. He had told himself he would deal with it later. He had told himself Robert was probably just calling about something property-related, something left over from their mother's estate. He had told himself it wasn't urgent. He had never called back. I didn't know, Daniel said. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't entirely true. He had known there was a call. He had chosen what to do with it. Robert nodded. Not with bitterness, with a kind of exhausted understanding that comes from a man who has been on the receiving end of a closed door long enough to recognize it from any angle. I know, he said. I know you didn't know what I was calling about, but I'll tell you what I was calling to say. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I was calling to say that I didn't want us to waste any more time. The words sat between them like something solid. 6 months ago, Daniel said quietly. 6 months ago. Daniel looked at the table. And the weight of that, the specific, unrecoverable weight of 6 wasted months added onto 11 wasted years, settled on him with a force that had nothing theatrical about it. This was not dramatic guilt. This was the quiet, grinding, absolutely real recognition that time is not returned. That the crossroads Obadiah described are not metaphorical places with signposts and warning lights. They are Tuesday afternoons. They are voicemails played alone in a garage. They are phone calls you don't return because today doesn't feel like the right day, and you tell yourself there will be other days. And sometimes there are, and sometimes there aren't. This is where Obadiah's fourth and final stage arrives with its full and devastating force. Not as ancient history, not as theological concept, but as a very ordinary moment in a very ordinary coffee shop where 2 ordinary men sit across from each other, and one of them has to reckon with the fact that he very nearly ran out of time. Because stage 4, the stage where the hardened heart crosses from habit into conviction, where coldness becomes identity, where the closed door becomes a permanent position. Stage 4 does not announce itself. It does not arrive with sirens or warnings or a final dramatic moment where you know you have crossed the line. It arrives the same way all the other stages arrived. Quietly, incrementally, in the accumulation of small choices that each felt in the moment entirely manageable. Edom did not wake up one morning and decide to be a nation without a conscience. They woke up one morning and made one more choice that looked exactly like the 1,000 choices before it. And that choice happened to be the last one. And they never knew it was the last one until it was too late to make a different one. Daniel had been one phone call away from stage 4. One ignored voicemail. One more day of not today. He had been standing at the very edge of the place Obadiah described, the place where the heart stops, just feeling nothing, and starts believing it is correct to feel nothing, and the only thing that had stopped him from stepping over was a cardiac event in his brother's chest, and a nurse named Linda, who sent 3 sentences to a number she got from a 28-year-old woman in Atlanta who refused to stop believing that her father was still reachable. That is how close it was. And that truth sat in Daniel's chest with more weight than any sermon he had ever heard. He looked up at Robert, and he said something he had not planned to say, had not rehearsed, had not even known was coming, until it was already out of his mouth. He said, "I'm sorry I took so long. Not I'm sorry for the lawsuit. Not I'm sorry for the specific itemized list of grievances and counter-grievances that had defined 11 years of silence. Just I'm sorry I took so long. I'm sorry that between the two of us, I was the one who kept the door closed. I'm sorry that I called it protection and let it become a prison, and by the time I understood the difference, I had already lost 6 months. I can't get back." Robert didn't say it's okay, because some things need to be received without immediately dissolved. Some apologies need to be held for a moment before they can be answered. Robert sat with it, and then he said, "I should have come to your door. I should have driven up here and knocked on your door instead of leaving a message." "Maybe," Daniel said. "I was afraid you'd turn me away." "I might have," Daniel said honestly. 3 weeks ago, I might have." Robert looked at him. "What changed?" Daniel thought about midnight, about 21 verses, about a book so short most people read past it without stopping. He thought about Carol's hands on his face. He thought about Melissa's voice saying smaller. He thought about a nurse's 3-sentence text message. He thought about all the ordinary, unglamorous instruments God had used to reach into a locked room and begin slowly the work of opening it. "I read something," Daniel said. "A prophet named Obadiah. You probably never heard of him." Robert smiled slightly. 21 verses, shortest book in the Old Testament. Daniel stared at him. "You've read it." "Our mother used to read it," Robert said quietly. "She read it to me once when I was about 15. I didn't understand it then. I looked it up again a few years ago." He paused. "After I tried to call you and you didn't call back." The coffee shop went very quiet between them. Their mother, who had stood between these 2 boys for their entire childhood, who had prayed over both of them, who had died with the wound between them still open, who had apparently, years before her death, read her younger son a 21-verse warning about what happens to brothers who let their hearts go cold toward each other. Daniel felt something break loose in him that had no name. Not grief exactly, not joy. Something that contained both the irreducible, complicated ache of a man who realizes that the thread connecting all the moments of his life goes further back than he knew. That the hand reaching toward him now was not just his brother's hand, but somehow also his mother's, and somehow also God's. and that all three had been reaching toward him through the same small, overlooked, skipped-past book of the Bible for longer than he had understood. He put his elbows on the table, pressed his hands together, and he said, voice low, "She knew, didn't she? She knew this was going to happen between us." "I think she saw it coming," Robert said. "I think she was trying to head it off. It took us 20 years after she read you that passage." "Better 20 years than never," Robert said. And there it was, the truth at the absolute center of the Book of Obadiah. The truth that survives all the warning and all the judgment and all the devastating portrait of what a hardened heart becomes when left unchecked. The truth tucked into the final verses of 21, the ones Carol had read alone at her kitchen table, and not yet shared the ones that come after every word of consequence, and stand there quietly like a door left open at the end of a long and difficult hallway. The kingdom shall be the Lord's. Not the kingdom of the hardened, not the kingdom of the self-protected, not the kingdom of the men who stood at the crossroads and turned their brothers away. The Lord's. The God who wrote the warning also wrote the ending. And the ending for those who hear the warning in time, for those who catch themselves at stage 3, instead of waking up irretrievably in stage 4, the ending is restoration. Not easy restoration. Not costless restoration. The kind that requires sitting across from someone in a coffee shop and saying words that are uncomfortable and true. The kind that requires a daughter who refuses to give up on her father. The kind that requires a wife who prays in the dark when she doesn't have the right words. The kind that requires one phone call to a nurse's station and 3 words passed through a stranger's voice into a hospital room. I know, I'm coming. Obadiah wrote his warning to a nation, but God speaks his warnings personally. He speaks them into kitchens and trucks and garages and hospital parking lots. He speaks them through daughters and wives and nurses and midnight readings of books. Most people skip. He speaks them as close as your own heartbeat, which is also always a reminder that time is still moving, that the door is still open, that the choice is still available. But hear this clearly, because Obadiah was not subtle about it. The door does not stay open indefinitely. The heart that keeps choosing stage 1 leads to stage 2. Stage 2 leads to 3. 3 stands at the border of 4. And 4 is where God looked at a nation and said, the day of reckoning is near, not as a threat, but as the honest, heartbroken announcement of a consequence that was never what he wanted. What he wanted was relationship. What he wanted was the brother turning toward the brother. What he wanted was the prodigal coming home. The lost sheep found the coin, recovered the wall that should never have been built, finally coming down. That is still what he wants. The question. Obadiah leaves every reader with the question that echoes out of 21 verses across 3,000 years and lands directly in whatever room you are sitting in right now is simply this. Which stage are you in? Not which stage were you in last year. Not which stage is someone else in. Right now. Today. In the relationship, you have been avoiding the phone call, you have been not returning the door. You have been keeping closed and calling it self-preservation. In the wound you have been holding so long that it stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like identity. Which stage are you in? Because if you can still ask that question, if something in this story found a crack in something you thought was sealed, then you are not in stage 4 yet. The door is still open. The warning is still a warning, and not yet a verdict. The God who wrote the ending of Obadiah is still writing yours. Daniel Hargrove drove home from that coffee shop a different man than the one who had driven to it. Not fixed a man in process, not healed a man turned in the right direction. He called Melissa from the car and told her the conversation had gone well. She cried again, and this time he let himself feel it. Didn't change the subject, didn't say she was being dramatic, just sat with it. Carol was waiting when he got home. She looked at his face, and she saw what she had been praying to see for 11 years. Not happiness exactly. Something more durable than happiness. Something that had survived stage 1 and stage 2 and the border of stage 3 and had come out the other side, still breathing, still moving, still oriented toward the light. She didn't ask how it went. She just said, "Are you hungry?" And he said, "Yeah, I actually am." And they went into the kitchen together. That is not a small ending. That is not an ordinary moment. A man who felt nothing sitting down to eat with the woman who prayed for him in the dark. That is the last verse of Obadiah made visible. The kingdom shall be the Lord's. Not because everything became perfect, but because the heart that was hardening had turned. And a turned heart in the hands of the God of Obadiah is never a finished story. It is always, always a beginning.